Last month, I began my four-part series on the Gospels. I talked a little bit about the Gospel of Matthew. I want to use my time this evening to talk about the Gospel of Mark. So first, I would like to do just a quick recap of what I had to say last month about the Gospel of Matthew. The modern scholars have noted that all of the material in the Gospel of Mark is included in the Gospel of Matthew. And so some have looked at it and said, look, the Gospel of Matthew is really the Gospel of Mark plus a collection of sayings that it has in common with the Gospel of Luke. And so they've speculated that it's basically, that is the Gospel of Matthew is basically Mark plus these sayings which were circulating at the time that the Gospel of Matthew was written. This hypothetical collection of sayings is sometimes referred to as the Q Gospel. If Matthew's Gospel was written in this way, then it's later than Mark and was almost certainly written after the death of Matthew. Against this modern view, we have the testimony of the early church that Matthew collected the logia, the sayings of Jesus, and that his Gospel was written first. It's actually why it appears first in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are in that order because Eusebius tells us that's the order that they were written in. If we accept the testimony of Papias, who was the bishop writing around the year 100, who put together quite a bit of information on early church history that unfortunately we only have fragments of today. But he's the one who tells us that Matthew gathered up these sayings of Jesus. Well, a question arises, when did Matthew do this? Did he gather up oral traditions that were circulating decades after the resurrection? Or did he do it during the time of Jesus' ministry? And I introduced the concept of amanuensis. Apologies to Dennis, because I don't actually speak Greek. I'm sure I'm not getting that quite right. But it's a personal scribe or personal secretary. This was the use of an amanuensis was quite common in the ancient world. Baruch, for example, in the Old Testament was the scribe who followed the prophet Jeremiah around, made notes, compiled the information, and it's from him that we get the book of Jeremiah. A man named Tertius played that same role with respect to the Apostle Paul. So this was a common way of doing things. It's not at all unlikely that Jesus might have had an amanuensis as well. Matthew would be the logical person. The other 11 were not educated men, but Matthew was. So I speculated that modern scholars may be overthinking the matter here, that all we need to do is look to the early church to tell us that Matthew gathered up these sayings, that he was chosen to be among the 12 to play this role of amanuensis, and that the early church testimony that Matthew's gospel was written first is what I accept. All right, on to the Gospel of Mark. So let's start with a question. Who was Mark? Most scholars believe that Mark is the same person as John Mark, who appears in the Acts of the Apostles. If so, then he was a cousin to Barnabas. His name is interesting. John is a Hebrew name, Mark is a Latin name. According to early tradition, he was born in Cyrene, and he met Jesus when he was working as one of the servants at the wedding in Cana. His mother's house was an early Christian safe house. In the Acts of the Apostles, we read how after the execution of James, Peter was arrested. While awaiting execution, he miraculously escaped from prison. He went to the house of Mark's mother to meet up with the remaining disciples. After his escape, Peter fled the territory of Herod Agrippa. He went first to Antioch, but then he journeyed on to several places, finally arriving in Rome in 42 AD. That's according to Eusebius. And Mark went with him on this journey. Mark served as Peter's translator or interpreter. Peter would preach, and Mark would translate for the crowd. If you ever make it to Rome, this is just a kind of a side note that came to me as I was working on this presentation. Don't miss Santa Maria in Trastevere. It's a church in the Trastevere neighborhood, which in the 1st century AD was the Jewish quarter. It was in the Trastevere neighborhood that Peter lived. And the house where Peter preached is that site now has the Basilica of Santa Maria in Trastevere on it. It's a magnificent church, and it's a fascinating place because every time they repair a water pipe, do anything, around that church, they find early Christian inscriptions, early Christian art, and a lot of it, it's on these tiles. They tack it up on the front of the church. So there's all these early anchors and pelicans, and it's really worth making some time in your visit. So Mark remained in Rome with Peter until AD 49 or 50, when Peter sent him to Alexandria in Egypt, where he established the church there. He was martyred in 68 AD, when followers of the Egyptian god Serapis tied him behind a horse and dragged him through the streets of the city. He died the following day from his injuries. There are a couple of interesting details in Mark's gospel. The first is the story of the young man in the Garden of Gethsemane, who, when the soldiers come and arrest Jesus, he interferes with their attempts to take Jesus into custody. In the scuffle that follows, his cloak is ripped off and he runs away naked. That story only occurs in Mark. It doesn't occur in any of the other gospel accounts or anywhere else. And it's not particularly germane to the story, so why include it? The most likely explanation is because that young man was Mark. Mark is, in a sense, signing his gospel by including this little personal account of what happened to him while he was in the Garden of Gethsemane at the time of Jesus' arrest. The second thing that's kind of interesting about Mark's gospel is that the earliest manuscripts, and probably the best manuscripts, end with the discovery of the empty tomb. Only in the later manuscripts of Mark do we have any resurrection appearances. So some contemporary scholars, critical scholars, have looked at this fact and they say, see, the earliest gospel makes no mention of the resurrection. Early Christians didn't know anything of any resurrection. The story of the resurrection is some later Christian myth-making. There are, of course, a number of problems with that argument, beginning with the fact that Jesus predicts his resurrection in Mark's gospel. All you have to do is read the rest of the document. And they went forth from there and passed through Galilee, for he taught his disciples and said unto them, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of men, and they shall kill him, and when he is killed, after 3 days he shall rise again. So why do our earliest and best manuscripts stop with the discovery of the empty tomb? I found I think it was at Catholic Answers, I found an article that offered a possible explanation for this that I find really interesting and quite compelling. Mark's gospel is a distillation of the preaching of Peter, and it has the character of a sermon. So where Matthew is concerned with making the argument that Jesus is the Messiah, right, and showing, for example, all the ways in which Jesus fulfills Old Testament prophecy about the Messiah, Mark is concerned with challenging people to accept him as their Savior. It's a call to faith, a call to action. We all stand before the empty tomb. And the question is, how do you respond? Do you make the leap of faith? Do you accept that he is risen? I think this article that I read, and it makes a lot of sense to me, is that the gospel ends there because it's a kind of challenge to us, to reflect on the story up to that point and decide whether we're in or we're out. So it's a fascinating document. Mark is a very interesting person. I thought it'd be a good second installment here. I would share a little bit of information with you about the gospel part. Thank you.